Hello friends, today I am doing a quick video to talk about vectorizing your hand lettering or calligraphy in Illustrator. So I actually have both Photoshop and Illustrator open right now because I'm going to be taking a hand lettered file from Photoshop and dragging it over to Illustrator to show you how to make it into a vector. The first thing that you should know about this is that there's a common misconception that you have to vectorize your calligraphy or hand lettering for everything that you do, which isn't true, because if you're digitally printing or flat printing a wedding invitation or a design that you create, vectorizing isn't going to take a huge part in that. Or what I mean to say is that your files do not have to be vectorized for those to print beautifully and to look great. That's something that I finally learned when I was first starting to design wedding invitations, and it kind of blew my mind because I didn't realize it. But if you are going to be printing your invitations or your design via letterpress or foil printing, then you will have to have those files vectorized, because that is how they create the plate for letterpress printing, is with all of those individual points per se that are created when you vectorize a file. So this is more of an intermediate tutorial, I guess. I'm still going to try to go super slow so that you guys can obviously understand what I'm doing, and hopefully beginners will be able to understand this too. But like I said, I already have my file completed in Photoshop. It's here on the right side. And I'm going to be taking this thank you, this hand lettered thank you piece that has been already cleaned up in Photoshop, and vectorizing it in Illustrator. I will also link below the tutorial that I have for digitizing your hand lettering or calligraphy within Photoshop first, and how to clean that up, so that if you need to go back to that step, that you have a resource for that. So let's go ahead and drag this thank you over to the Illustrator file that I opened up. You're going to see that my cursor is on the thank you layer, and that's the piece that I have right here that I'm going to grab. So I'm just going to slide that over onto the Illustrator board, and it appears here in the middle. Now if I hold down the shift button, I can drag this and make it bigger without losing the shape of it. If you don't grab the shift button, it could end up looking like this, and that's obviously not what we want. So I'm going to undo that. But you're going to see here that when I click on this, the thank you, it's obviously a little rough. I'll zoom in a little more so you can kind of see. It's got some rough edges, and what's going to happen when we vectorize this is that it's going to smooth it out a little more. And what I want to show you how to do is how to vectorize your hand lettering or your calligraphy without losing the personality of your style and the font that you've created per se, the handwritten font that you naturally have when you write. I have people who have reached out to me before and just said that they don't know how to vectorize something and maintain the personality of the piece, because what happens is they end up tweaking it so much it doesn't even look like their handwriting or their calligraphy. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a couple tips and tricks to kind of, like I said, like maintain your style and keep it very distinctly yours, instead of it looking like something, that was typed out from a computer. So make sure that you select the piece that you dragged into Illustrator, and you're going to see all these options pop up here at the top of the screen. I have the most updated version of Illustrator, which means I have the CC 2018, the Creative Cloud Suite. So if you have an older program, it might look a little different, but I am up to date, just so that you know. And the first thing we're going to do is click the image trace option. And if I highlight it, notice it says converts image into a tracing object, which essentially is a vector. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and you'll immediately be able to notice that a big change has happened to the lettering, and that everything has kind of been smoothed out a lot. So it's lost the little kind of like bleed marks and feathering that appears along the lettering. Anytime that you put a pen to paper, those tend to be there. And now everything is just like looking really smooth and clean. A lot of times, if people like how this looks, they'll just hit expand and they'll leave it at that. But that's not what we want to do. We actually want to go over and click this little kind of like square looking, list looking icon up here. This is actually the image trace panel. So we're going to open it. I'm going to hit drop down for advanced. And these are all of the options that we have for vectorizing and creating an image trace, essentially. So the modes are all looking pretty good. Normally I stick with default. Black and white mode is perfect because obviously this lettering is only black right now. If you were doing a venue illustration, then you might have to use a different preset for doing like sketched art or line art. That's something that you can kind of experiment with, but for now I'm just going to be talking specifically about vectorizing your hand lettering. So the very first thing we have right here is the threshold. There's less or there's more. Essentially what this does, I'll show you what happens if it's really high, is that it kind of makes the lettering look almost thicker, if you will. Because if we do the threshold really low, then the lettering looks like too thinned out. It doesn't really resemble kind of what I had created originally. Right in the middle is about perfect. And as the threshold goes up, I think that the curves do get a little smoother. So this is just something you can toy with to see how it kind of changes the look of the lettering. I'm going to keep that right in the middle. And actually one of the very first things I like to do as well is go down to the bottom to these options and hit ignore white. So that way, if I were to create, let's just throw a rectangle in here real quick and change the color of this to red. If I were to create something like this and send it to the back, then there isn't anything that's blocking, you know, there's like no white background that's blocking us from seeing that red rectangle or red square. Whereas if you don't hit ignore white, like this, then that's going to be like blocked off. It's not visible. All right, so make sure you click ignore white. I'm going to delete that red rectangle. That was just for you guys to kind of envision and see exactly what I was talking about. And now we're going to go to some of the other advanced items that are in here. I had a friend mention to me that the amount of paths that she had on her vectored lettering seemed impossibly high. Like there just seemed to be way too many. So that's right, actually, right here is where you can kind of play with that. So the more paths that I add to the lettering, the more dots and points are going to appear. If you go too low with the paths, this is what it ends up looking like, and it's a total mess and a total disaster. So normally I leave that kind of like right in the middle as well. And I'll show you what I mean by those little like anchor points and dots that appear along the lettering when we finally go and expand the piece. The corners and the noise, I cannot exactly tell you what these advanced options do specifically. But you can kind of play around with them and see if they change anything up. It looks like it just kind of rounds out the lettering a little nicer. And the noise doesn't seem to be making a huge difference. If you hover over, it'll kind of like tell you what things do. But that's just something that you kind of have to experiment and toy around with. Excuse me. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to make the threshold just a little bit higher. You always want the preview to be checked so that the lettering is changing as you change all of these options. And then once you find something that you think looks pretty good, and like I said, still resembles your lettering and the handwriting that you have pulled in, then you're going to hit the expand option. So you're going to convert the traced object into paths, and all of these paths make up the vectorized object. So Now when we click on it, you're going to see if I hover over, it's telling me anchor, path, anchor. There's all these like tiny little dots. So let me zoom in. And as we get closer, you can kind of see what I mean. That all of these anchor points have now appeared onto the lettering. And this is going to allow us to dramatically change the lettering if you want to. First, before I do anything else, I need to explain the tools up here in the upper left. The one on the left is the selection tool, and the one on the right is the direct selection tool. The difference between them is that the one on the right, the direct selection tool, is the one that you're going to be using anytime you want to play with the anchors that are put into place on your lettering. If you hit the selection tool, you're not going to be able to edit individual paths and points. You're just going to be dragging the whole thing around on your screen. Whereas the direct selection tool, let me show you an example. If I click onto this anchor, I can drag it, and I've just changed an entire blob of my hand lettering, which obviously looks pretty terrible. I wouldn't want to do that. So Command Z on the Mac is what allows me to undo that super quickly. If you're not super familiar with shortcuts, that's what that is. So now we just kind of need to take a look at how smooth the lettering is and whether or not there's anything we can update and change. The curve of this T is looking amazing. Like, I really like how it turned out. The downward stroke. However, the upper stroke of the T right here is kind of a little wobbly along this point. Now, like I was kind of saying earlier, sometimes it's nice to maintain those little tweaks and distinctions because that kind of gives your lettering its handwritten feel. But other times, if you're going to be using, like, for example, this is actually for a wax seal design. So I would be wanting to smooth those out as much as possible because I want the wax seal to turn out very smooth and professional looking. So we're going to make sure we're on the direct selection tool. We're going to click that, and we're going to zoom in to play around with this anchor just a little bit. So you're going to notice that there are actually these handles on the lettering, or on the paths and the anchors. These little handles kind of allow you, so if I pull it down, it looks like that. If I pull it back up, it rounds out a little more naturally. And as you can see, I kind of like fixed the lip of the upper part of the T a little bit. And I can smooth this and going down here. Now, this is kind of the extremely long and tedious way to go through and edit a piece of lettering because you can spend hours upon hours tweaking all of these individual points and paths until everything looks absolutely perfect. At that point, that's where you kind of risk losing the integrity of the hand lettering look a little bit if you're spending a ton of time doing that. So my favorite tool to actually use is if you hold down on the shaper tool icon here. So it's kind of in the second category of tools. You hold it down and you go to the smooth tool. I'm about to change your life because this tool changed mine. And actually make sure that you use the direct selection tool to select what you want to change. So I'm going to go ahead, like if I wanted to change this piece, I would have selected it, but I'm going to be changing this piece. And then you use the smooth tool. I'm going to zoom in here again to kind of just draw along the line that you're trying to smooth out. And you're going to notice that made a huge difference. So if I undo it, see how that was kind of wobbly? And then I'll redo it. And it smoothed it out so much, and I didn't have to spend the time tweaking each and every single little anchor point. So let's see if I can go ahead and fix down here a little bit as well. If you drag along the side, yep. So that helps smooth it out just a little bit more as well. And there's a lot of little individual places along here. Like I don't love how this part of the H looks. So a lot of times it's actually more helpful. This might have something to do with that kind of corners option that I was showing you before we expanded the object. that this would make it more smooth. So sometimes you're going to have a little point in the corner that allows you to round it out naturally. I hope you kind of caught that. This allows me to like pull in or out to make the corners a little smoother, which is super nice and helpful. But not all corners and not all curves are going to have that. For example, this inward part of the H right here, it only has these 2 anchor points in all the handles, and I can spend the time like tweaking the handles if I want to, which makes that curve look better. Or I can actually go in, let's see, to the bottom of this A, and if I wanted to have a nice point in there instead of a curve, I can actually delete one of the anchor points. So you would hold down the pen tool and you would go delete anchor point tool, and you could take it out, and then you'd use the direct selection tool to go back in again and kind of work on that curve. I hope that makes sense. And then this anchor here, maybe I want to move it just a little bit to smooth that out. Here's another horrible bump in the lettering that just looks really awkward on the back end of this K. So let's hit the direct selection tool, and then let's click the smooth tool and bring that back in on the back side of the K to fix that. And oh my gosh, that looks so much better. Obviously there's still a little bit of work that can be done in here, like moving this anchor point up just a bit to make the point on the K a little sharper where the N and the K are connecting. And then this inward curve on the K, all of the K is kind of messed up, to be honest. So let's go ahead and use the direct selection tool again and the smooth tool. And first I'll go on the outside of the K. And this doesn't have to be precise with the smooth tool, which is really nice. That already looks a lot better. So as you'll notice, when I'm using the smooth tool, it's actually editing out some of the anchor points that we don't need anymore. So that kind of takes the manual labor out of like going in and editing every single one of those anchor points. The other misconception is that you have to touch every single anchor point within the lettering, which you definitely don't need to. Because if we zoom out, I've kept the integrity of the hand lettering look, while still keeping it a little bit rough. And there's things that can be cleaned and fixed and made better, like I'm going to smooth out the A here. But there's also certain parts of the lettering that don't necessarily have to be fixed, because it doesn't all have to be perfect depending on the look that you're trying to achieve. And if you start messing with everything too much, then it really doesn't have that handwritten feel anymore. So a lot of this, like I'll be entirely honest, takes a lot of kind of experimentation and time to figure out. The most important thing to know is that, like I said, there's only certain instances where you actually have to vectorize your lettering, in certain instances, when you don't need to vectorize your lettering. So don't be spending the time creating vectors for everything if you really don't need to. There's great articles online that kind of explain the difference between vectored images and then just a flat digital or like rasterized version of the image, I think is the technical term for that. If you're curious for when you need to vectorize it and when you don't need to vectorize it. Basically, when you have points all over the lettering, which is what we've created, points and paths, that's what allows you to expand the lettering a ton without it pixelating or looking super weird. So like no matter how we zoom in, this still looks super clean and super smooth. Whereas if I go back to this Photoshop file where the thank you was in the first place, if I were to zoom in super, super close, it starts getting really fuzzy, and this is what it looks like. So if I were to blow this up and like print this really big, it would end up looking like this. So it would look fuzzy and it wouldn't look clean at all. So a lot of times you have to vectorize things if you're going to be creating a logo for someone's branding, because maybe they need to get that put onto a huge poster or a huge banner if they're doing some sort of like pop-up shop or promotion somewhere. And that's only 700%. And I'm zoomed in over here on my Illustrator file at 2,400%, and it's still not losing like its integrity or smoothness at all. So that is kind of my brief overview and version of vectorizing. Obviously, I could spend a lot more time cleaning this up and fixing it if I wanted to. But for the sake of obviously the length of this tutorial, I'm not going to show you the entire process of me doing that. And I recommend too that when you start vectorizing things, obviously it's going to take a little longer at first, but when you start learning it better, set a timer for yourself. And if you set like 30 minutes to vectorize something and you've been spending that whole time doing it, then just take a step back and look at the piece first. Before editing it anymore, because at that mark you've probably reached, if you're spending 30 minutes on something, you've probably reached a point where it looks good enough, and people aren't going to notice the tiny little imperfections of the curves of the lettering. Only you're going to be able to see that, because like the quote says, you are your own worst critic, or we are our own worst critics. And I feel like that applies to a lot of different things, including perfectionism when it comes to vectorizing or digitizing lettering or whatever it may be. So I hope that overall this was super helpful. Like I said, I tried to explain the steps kind of as slowly as possible. Feel free to drop some questions below. There are always multiple ways to do things within Photoshop or Illustrator. So if you have a tip to share or something you really like to do when you vectorize, then by all means, make sure you comment that too, so that people can learn from you and your expertise, because there's never only one way to do something right. Enjoy the rest of the week, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Subscribe if you want to get more videos from me, and if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up.